I think we'll get started as it's now 1 p.m. Central Time. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jessica, and I am currently serving as the Survivorship Vista at the American Indian Cancer Foundation. We recognize that these are challenging and unprecedented times that are reminding us of the deep societal inequities that make certain populations more vulnerable to harm and disease than others. As June is National Cancer Survivor Awareness Month, we would like to shine a light on cancer survivorship in Indian country and elevate and feature the diverse voices and experiences of our cancer survivors, which includes family members and caregivers. We are honored and excited to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Bouchard and Mr. William Mabey from the Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center to present on honoring the journeys of cancer caregivers in Indigenous perspective. Dr. Bouchard is a sociologist whose research examines how social class influences patient-provider interactions, treatment adherence, and cancer caregiving. Dr. Bouchard also examines the role of social networks and social support in shaping access to health-related resources, healthcare navigation, and health communication. Mr. William Mabey is a member of the Great Hill People, also known as the Seneca Nation. Before joining Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center as a community relations coordinator, he worked for 7 years as a clinical exercise specialist for the Seneca Nation Health System. His current work includes cancer prevention research, cancer screening efficacy, as well as exploring the impact of ancestral lifeways on contemporary diseases. Will is one of 4 staff members that compose the Roswell Park Center for Indigenous Cancer Research. Today's webinar is scheduled to last an hour, including a question and answer session. This presentation will be recorded and also made available on the American Indian Cancer Foundation's website and YouTube page. All participants will be muted to enable the speakers to speak without interruption, but please do send in your questions using the chat feature, as we'll have time to answer them at the end. With that, I would like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Bouchard and Mr. William Mabey.
Thank you. This is actually my second presentation with ACAF. And when Misha approached me about doing this presentation, I kind of hesitated a little bit because I wasn't really sure if I was maybe the best person for the job. Caregiving is certainly more of Dr. Bouchard's background. I'm thankful to have her on with me to answer any questions we may have at the end. But then I realized that I didn't have to look very far to find people in my own family and my extended family who were cancer caregivers, my mom, my dad, my grandmother, my aunts, uncles. And I guess when you live a busy life, you sort of forget about that. And so with that intention, what I did is I thought I would extend my role as community relations coordinator and do some real community relations, which is go out in the community and talk to people about their experiences. Because my experience may be different than other people and vice versa. And I found that through this journey, through this several months I've been working on this project, that there was a wide array of experiences with some common themes as well, which we'll address towards the end of the presentation. So what we'll do is we'll get right into the actual presentation. All right. I believe you can see my screen now. So the title of this presentation is Honoring the Journeys of Cancer Caregivers, an Indigenous Perspective. Now, I want to just give a short caveat is that this presentation offers both non-Native and Native American perspectives. I think there are so many people that are involved in the caregiving process. I certainly didn't want to omit anybody that could potentially be helping in this process. So a quick disclaimer, the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect those of Roswell Park or ACAF. All information should be considered educational and not intended to replace the advice of qualified medical professionals. So right out of the gate, I think I'm going to introduce Dr. Bouchard, who is a colleague of mine at Roswell Park. And I want her to discuss the importance of increased cancer caregiver awareness and support. It really was Dr. Bouchard and her team who introduced myself to this cancer care continuum as it relates to cancer caregiving. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Bouchard.
Thanks, Will. So one of the things that I think it's helpful to start talking about right off the start is what do we mean under this kind of umbrella term of caregivers? So from a clinical and research perspective, we often define caregivers as anyone who helps provide any kind of support to a person who's experiencing a cancer diagnosis or cancer treatment. And so that may be helping with some of the medical tasks the patient has to perform at home, but it also can be things not really related to medical care at all, being emotional support for the cancer patient, also doing household tasks. And we know that those kinds of activities are really critical for the patient on their own cancer journey. But we also know from a lot of research that the experiences that the caregiver has are often different than the patient. So the caregiver and the patient are really on, they're experiencing the same cancer care, but they really have very distinct journeys on that cancer care. And so we're coming to understand much more of the unique experiences cancer caregivers have, and the needs they have related to their own meaning making around their loved one's cancer experiences, feelings of stress or worry or fear that they may have that may be different than those thoughts and feelings that the patient is having. And then also the different information caregivers need to be able to help support the patient throughout their cancer care. And this is all really important because as medical technology is really advancing, more and more cancer treatment is happening at home outside of clinical settings. And so the abilities for patients and their loved ones to help perform these activities, adhere to treatment, understand symptoms that might be happening at home are really critical for the patient's cancer care. And so in that way, we think of these informal and lay caregivers as really central members of the cancer care team.
Great, perfect explanation. We probably can end the presentation there. And I think that what we're exploring now with the Center for Indigenous Cancer Research is how that journey for an Indigenous caregiver differs. And I think there are some distinct differences, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, that are really important to highlight. If we know what those challenges are, we certainly can work collectively as from the center level, the community level, to the level of the family to address those issues. So it makes the experience, I think, a little bit more tolerable at times. I remember watching family members go through the caregiving process, and their personalities changed, they physically changed. I could tell they were clearly very stressed out. And as we'll find out later in the presentation, they weren't seeking out resources. They didn't know they existed. And I think that's one of the reasons this topic is so important, in bringing awareness to caregivers and their individual needs. As you mentioned, Dr. Bouchard, is they do have similar but different journeys in several distinct ways. So when I was sifting through this topic, I discovered that there is limited research on the Indigenous cancer caregiver, or just caregiver, generally speaking, their journeys, or the actual data itself is fairly limited. So what I did is I looked at the current definition of what a caregiver, and I think Dr. Bouchard did a great job at actually highlighting what a caregiver is. What do we consider a caregiver medically speaking, or in sort of a research type of way? And we think of caregivers as unpaid loved ones who give the person with cancer physical and emotional care, as Dr. Bouchard had said. They may be spouses, partners, family members, close friends, acquaintances, but most often they're not trained. They're not nurses, they're not doctors. They're typically people without formal training, and this seemingly happened spontaneously. They had no warning most times that they were going to be thrown into this role, which can elicit a lot of feelings and a lot of different types of circumstances. And then as I was talking to more people through these interviews, which I'll discuss here shortly, and also looking at some of the research, I realized that Native Americans or Indigenous people, generally speaking, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but one of the common things I saw was the definition of caregiver was quite foreign. And oftentimes there was some negative connotations to that. I had spoke with people who had thought caregivers were a paid position. They didn't look at themselves as a caregiver because they were a family member doing what they felt they should be doing for a sick family member. And I think a very poignant quote that I had discovered through this journey of research and understanding the Indigenous caregiver journey process was, caregiving was regarded as a reflection of the cultural ethos of interdependency and reciprocity among the generations. And caring for somebody was a position of honor. It wasn't looked at as an inconvenience in any way, which I certainly, through in my previous experiences, I saw that. I saw the stress that a caregiver was going through and how this negatively impacted their personal lives. And many of the Native families I spoke to didn't look at being a caregiver that way, which I thought was really, really interesting. And then I went a little bit further and I said, well, where does this come from? Where does this idea come from? And I'm sure it comes from multiple avenues. It's multi-generational, these values. But as I was talking to one of my mentors, we had discussed the Great Law of Peace, the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. And as I was exploring the Great Law, I realized this is truly the foundation of connectedness and caring throughout all nations of Haudenosaunee. And so I felt it'd be very poignant that I actually show a video, which I believe is in this slide here. So hopefully this video works. Dr. Bouchard, give me a thumbs up if you can see the video. But this is a video that I happened to find via PBS, and it has several prominent Haudenosaunee elders sort of reciting their interpretation of the Great Law. And I think we'll see at the end of the video how this law, these principles and values tie deeply today in our communities. Dr. Bouchard, can you see that video? No? Okay. All right, what about the presentation? Can you see that now?
Yep, we can see the presentation, but nothing.
Okay. Well, we're just going to skip right past that. And I was concerned that editing that video might cut into our time at the end, so it may be a good thing. But essentially what I'll say about the Great Law is it is deeply rooting about caring about one another. And when I was doing these interviews, I sensed that amongst the people in the community, that they still felt very strongly that it was important that they care for one another at all costs, and oftentimes at the expense of their own health and well-being. And through looking at some of the literature, and as I mentioned, it is fairly limited, but I did see some really important themes pop up fairly consistently in terms of Indigenous caregiver challenges. Oftentimes caregivers can experience physical, emotional, social, and financial distress as those they are caring for. The journey is different though. And oftentimes we find that caregivers experience physical distress, a strain on their social lives, etc. And another interesting theme was more people moving into urban areas and away from their tribal lands and some of their traditional supports. Unmet social service needs due to inadequate tribal funding through IHS, which is really a hot topic in terms of care. Typically Native American, Indigenous folks across the United States receive much less funding per person than any other demographic. Indigenous caregivers are less likely to voice their thoughts, which limits access to appropriate supports. Just using my father, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me, discussing his journey as well. He sort of just went through his caregiving process alone, completely alone. And I just couldn't imagine not having any type of support or anyone to lean on when I would, during this time in need. And historically, there's a distrust in most institutionalized programs, but specifically programs such as nursing homes, living in remote locations, and lack of internet access. And just as a side note, some of the work that we have done through Roswell and some of our, our sort of our understanding of cancer in general is your location often dictates your treatment course or what type of treatment that you get. And we know that our relatives out west oftentimes live in very, very remote locations. They may live several hours away from a cancer center, as well as our relatives up north in Alaska. So this can be a very, very challenging obstacle to face as it relates to both the treatment of cancer and support needed for the caregiver itself. High risk of burnout due to prior traumatic life events, which I know that is something that I've discussed many times in previous discussions, was historical traumas, generational traumas, and that we don't think about as we're going through life, but this potentially could have a long-lasting effect on our resiliency or our lack thereof. Sometimes this can prove to be very beneficial, and other times it can have sort of a detrimental effect on our resiliency and our ability to handle stress. And let's face it, being a caregiver is a very stressful endeavor. Jobs and other family obligations can prove to be very challenging for caregivers. And I think this is one of the most common themes I had seen talking to community members, as well as looking through some of the existing literature, was there's a lack of cultural competency from healthcare providers in both the sort of the local and the center-wide level. And I remember reading a story about an individual who brought some of their traditional artwork with them inside of their hospital room. And the items were discarded because the nurses and doctors assumed that this was just junk laying around, and it was very detrimental to the individual. And we know that there is now a push, especially at Roswell Park, I believe is one of the sort of forerunners in this, but providing cultural competency to all levels at the institution, so things like that don't happen. And as I mentioned before, there's been limited research that focuses on the needs of Indigenous caregivers. And as we'll see, and as I've discussed briefly, that the needs may be different than other demographics. So getting to the heart of what I actually tried to accomplish, and what we as a community tried to accomplish during this project, was understanding Indigenous perspectives. So what I did is I did some brief, casual interviews with both non-Native and Native caregivers in the Allegheny Territory here in Western New York. I kind of went back and forth about the questions I wanted to ask, and I knew that they needed to be brief. I didn't want to burden somebody with long interviews. I know that given the landscape right now has been very, very stressful, and these conversations can elicit trauma and they can elicit stress and anxiety. So I try to be as sensitive to that as possible. So I just asked 5 brief questions, non-leading questions, open-ended questions, to get a feel for what people were saying without being influenced. The first question was, describe how you became a caregiver. The second, has your family structure, culture, or faith influenced you as a caregiver? How has being a caregiver impacted your life? What have you learned about being a caregiver that you were unaware of before being one yourself? And describe the resources offered to you as a caregiver. So in the corresponding slides, we'll see some of those responses. So for the first question, describing how you became a caregiver, usually the caregiver was not expecting it. There was a doctor's appointment that turned out to be a very, very stressful time. They were thrust into that caregiving role without really having any time to prepare. So it's often a very traumatic experience. And that was the one common theme that I saw through these interviews. And I'd like to read all these quotes in their entirety to do service and honor the people who were gracious enough to conduct these interviews with me. I never saw myself as a caregiver. I just did what family does, care for one another. And that was a theme that I'd mentioned earlier in the presentation. I cared for both a sibling and a significant other who were terminally ill with cancer. It was a stressful time, but you just do what you have to do to make sure that they are cared for. There isn't much time to think or do much else. And that is a very, very common thing that the caregivers I've worked with and we work with say. There's just not There's interventions, there's programs, there are resources, although they may be sparse, there are resources, but there's just not enough time. And one of the propositions I make in this presentation is, what can we do? What can a caregiver do in a short period of time that could be the most beneficial? My husband was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and thankfully my experience working with cancer patients prepared me for it, and it felt somewhat familiar to me. The second question was, has your family structure, culture, faith influenced you as a caregiver? I was taught your entire family has responsibility to care for a sick member. It was also not so much a sense of inconvenience, but a traditional value that I've always known. In respect to our territory, some Native Americans still combine traditional healing, herbal remedies, ceremony, etc., with modern scientific medicine and caring for the sick. As challenging as it is, the cancer process has brought the family closer together, and they'll take care in the caregiving process. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier was, in terms of some of the challenges, is as Indigenous peoples move further away from their traditional lands or their families, there's a tendency for a lot of the traditional ceremony and some of the traditional ways of healing to sort of kind of just fall in the background a little bit. And it's no fault of anybody's. I think it's just sort of the way things play out when we move away from our homelands. And this can prove to be detrimental in a lot of ways for folks who move away, and then they're thrust in this caregiving position, or they're thrust in the position of being a cancer patient and have limited resources available to them. How has being a caregiver impacted your life? And this was the most humbling part of the project for me, was to hear firsthand accounts about how this shaped an individual. And every person said they were the different person they were after being a caregiver than they were before. And most times, I would argue for the better. Consideration for other human beings, humbled by the strength of the human resolve in face of certain death. You know, during one of these interviews, the individual who was talking to me about this really had no idea of how strong somebody could be in that position, and how indifferent that they were about their, this impending suffering that they were going to endure, and was really taken back by that. Probably the biggest impact being a caregiver has had on my life is a realization that having good health and being able to perform even the smallest task is a true blessing. Overall, put me into a position to address mortality and self-care. It was a reminder to make sure you are always well. There's always more to learn about taking care of yourself and your family. It's important to share knowledge from being a caregiver with friends and family. And that's a very poignant statement as well. I feel like every individual who participated with me in this project was willing and open to share their experience. And you could say that maybe they were craving this way to express themselves. It certainly is a very trying time and traumatic when you're watching someone you care for suffer like this. So they're more than willing to offer their experiences, and in a way was very therapeutic. The next question was, what have you learned about caregivers that you were unaware of before being one yourself? More empathy for the sick person develops after being a caregiver. Recognize your own strength to care for the sick you did not realize you had before. And that was another common theme as well, as people really recognize that they had the strength to do this. They had the strength to be a caregiver. They didn't think they would at first, but they found a way to do it. And I think that is a testament to the human resolve as a whole, and the Indigenous resolve as well. Two different things. You have to learn to be patient. You do not know how that person is feeling mentally and physically. They do not tell you how they are feeling. It comes out in different ways. It comes out as anger and frustration. You can't take anything personally, even though it is very difficult. I could have not predicted the difficulty of being a cancer caregiver. It is impossible to predict the trauma in seeing a person suffer through such a difficult illness. If you had to be a caregiver every day, it would affect your physical and mental health. And we know this to be true across the board. Individuals who are caregivers, they experience some type of physical and emotional distress. It may not always be palpable or very easily measured, but it's certainly there. You don't know what you are going to do until you go through it. The amount of time and patience required is much higher than expected. I didn't realize that I would ever have to be put in that position. I had to develop the confidence to be able to step up to the plate. You must put yourself on the back burner to help others, but now know you must take care of yourself as well so you don't develop anxiety or burnout. And Dr. Bouchard, I think, is probably one of the leading experts in caregiver burnout and caregiver fatigue. And maybe at the end, we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit further, because it happens very, very often. And when this happens to a caregiver, it limits their ability to not only take care of them for themselves, which is equally as important, but care for their loved one. And this was also very alarming, I think, when I asked this question, was describing the resources and support available to caregivers. And the statements were all fairly consistent. I'm not aware of resources available for caregivers, although I'm sure they exist. I use my family and friends as my support system. There were no resources available at that time, or none that was presented at that time. There are not really a lot of resources for caregivers. You must learn it on your own, basically. Any information on how to care for cancer patients is obtained from the doctors. Would use resources if they're available, such as counseling. There are not really a lot of resources for caregivers. You must learn to do it on your own, basically. Well, that's actually a reiteration of the previous statement. And I think that was across the board one of the themes that was quite apparent. People did not realize there were supports available to them. And at the tribal level, resources that a lot of the IHS clinics that folks rely on for support system and social services and counseling are very limited. And I think a lot of the tribal clinics have good intentions, but there's just not enough resources to provide a robust caregiver support program. And I believe if there was one, there would be, it would be a crucial part of the health in our Indigenous communities. There's clearly a need there for support. During one of the interview questions, one of the interviewees had said that there was one time that I needed help, and there's such a bureaucratic red tape that by the time we got through the process, that we didn't need help anymore. We figured it out on our own. So there was a lag time in terms of being able to obtain these supports when they're needed. Of course, it doesn't do a lot of good for somebody to come ask for help and there's no help for several weeks or months. That's kind of counterproductive. And that's the type of, like I said, that's the type of red tape that a lot of tribal communities are experiencing. And I would say that to counter that, the family structure in our Indigenous communities is very, very strong in comparison. It is very strong, and a lot of the caregiving efforts are distributed amongst the family members. And this turns out to be a crucial part of the caregiving process. And families without that, or individuals without that support, tend to struggle a little bit more without that family support. So although there may not be the community-wide or the tribal support, and that's not always the case. There are programs across this country that do have very good, robust programs for their Indigenous community members. That the family structure can oftentimes, or the family strength can oftentimes mitigate some of those, some of those voids in the continuum of care. So the common themes, and we mentioned some of these going through these slides, but most people do not view themselves as caregivers. Some Indigenous cancer caregivers did not feel that being a caregiver negatively impacted their life, which I thought was pretty stunning. One of the interviews I had done, I kind of did a double take when I heard this. And this individual, as it turns out, has been caring for loved ones that have been ill most of their adult life. And so they didn't feel like it really changed much of anything. This was just something that they did that all the family members, not just her, but all the family members had done for one another. So it just was sort of another day. Life didn't really change that much. Nearly all cancer caregivers stated they experienced distress, although some did not recognize they had high levels of stress at that time. There was an equal number of people who felt caregiving diminished their mental health, and those who felt that it brought them deep meaning and purpose. And I would say that most times people in the midst of this are experiencing some type of distress. But in hindsight, looking back, they say, it was a tough experience. And I wouldn't want to have to go through that all the time, but going through that made me a stronger person. It gave me a perspective on the value of life I didn't have before. It gave me perspective on the value of my culture more than it had before. And I realized how important culture was in making it through this journey. And those traditional values propelled me forward, allowed me to endure some of the suffering that I was seeing and I was witnessing and I was feeling. And it's an incredibly humbling thing to hear somebody say, and that was consistently what I heard. And what I love about these projects is we always get a chance to see the human resolve in its purest form, which is, I don't think we think about that. I don't think about the strength that we have as individuals, as an Indigenous community, the resiliency that we all exude and what we're capable of. It's very easy to feel weak, disenfranchised, and to feel like, maybe we're not good enough, or maybe we don't have enough. And we don't know how we're going to get through a situation, but consistently when I talk to the community, they say the same thing. Being a caregiver, going through the process, having family, it made me stronger. I don't feel weaker by it. I feel like I have a better, more healthy perspective. And this can be incredibly powerful moving forward with their lives in terms of how they look at their lives now, how they value their lives, how they value their family life now, how they value culture. All these things can be appreciated, or they can be enhanced after being a caregiver. And sometimes this process can last weeks, months, or years, or indefinitely. Sometimes people are caregivers their entire lives. So that experience can certainly vary based on individual circumstances. But seeing that human condition in its purest form gives me certainly a lot of hope that we're on the right track, in that these type of discussions are so important to let people know that there are resources, they are cared about. Their culture can provide so many powerful tools to make it through the experience, and to find meaning and purpose. And finding meaning and purpose in anything is a feat in itself. It's really easy to get caught up with all the white noise, especially now that's happening. But to sift through all that and to find your true meaning in your existence is invaluable. And, just to pay honor to our caregivers, and there are many caregivers. And I think that this discussion has a far-reaching, kind of a far-reaching effect. And there are caregivers of all different backgrounds, all different demographics, and they're taking care of people with many, many different conditions. And so, I wanted to pay homage to all of those caregivers, especially in our Native communities, by talking about some of the signs. And I don't think people realize they're under duress during this time. We're caught up in the process, or caught up in the day-to-day operations and trying to care for somebody with a very complicated, complex illness. And so some of these signs of caregiver distress are easily irritated or angry, feelings of being overwhelmed, or any combination of emotional distress, anxiety, or panic, poor quality sleep followed by feeling tired or abnormally fatigued, gaining or losing weight, sadness or loss of interest in activities you once enjoyed, an increase in addictive behaviors, or frequent headaches, illness, or bodily pain. And oftentimes, based on my experience in these discussions, people often experience all of these symptoms at one time. So you can imagine what it's like to not get enough sleep, but then you add many other, I think, manifestations of being a caregiver, and the amount of sort of relentless stress that you endure, how this can really has the potential to break somebody down. And that's what we talk about, or that's what we mean when we discuss burnout. It's just this constellation of symptoms that eventually cause the entire the whole person to crash. They simply can't function under normal circumstances anymore. And obviously, the individual, this is catastrophic, and it's also devastating for the folks they care for. And this is oftentimes when you find caregivers unable to care. They're unable to sort of uphold their duties, and the patient often ends up in some type of assisted living or nursing homes. So if we can have these discussions, if we can bring awareness to what this looks like and mitigate it, provide these resources before it reaches this point, then both the caregiver and the individual with the illness are going to have the best possible outcomes. So this topic is of paramount importance. And reading through some of the literature, I saw that there's a lot of really helpful hints in terms of what caregivers should do. So I want to try to visualize what some activities that a caregiver might be able to do to sort of organize the chaos and organize some of these responsibilities. And one of the checklist points was that accept help whenever you can, set realistic goals, and focus on what you were able to provide. It's unrealistic to believe that one person can provide the needs for a chronically ill person across the board. And we know that in our Indigenous families, our Indigenous communities, there is a holistic approach to caring for one another. And there's oftentimes family members and friends and tribal services that are able to offer some type of reprieve or additional service to help the caregiver. And so what I did is I created just a quick little spreadsheet that you could jot down on a piece of paper if you didn't have access to a computer, but it's just a way of mapping out your weekly routine with the expected activities and the individuals or the services that would be helping you out. And this will help organize your thoughts and organize the thoughts and the anxiety and all the responsibilities of the caregiver, our cancer caregivers. And you can see I listed a few different random activities there that might be important to one of our Indigenous relatives, and how we can, as a community, as a family, spread out responsibility so the burden doesn't fall solely on one person. It's just too much. And I think by preparing a list of ways people can help you, it allows you to allow them to choose how they can help and keep track of individual responsibilities for easy reference. And another one of the common checklist points was taking care of yourself. Prioritize your well-being. Set a time each day to care for yourself. It's really easy, and it's really easy when you're not a caregiver for personal care and wellness to take a back seat. So it never hurts to jot down your values and goals as it relates to your health. If walking, your appointments, dance, ceremony, meditation, other type of personal health goals are valuable to you, make sure you write those down. Identify them, because it's really easy to forget when you're very busy. And then, going back to the previous slide, if there's a day that you as a caregiver have respite care, or you have somebody else taking your loved one to a medical appointment, use that time to care for yourself. Use that time to, exercise or to eat well or to be mindful, or any type of activity that you find of value. And as Dr. Bouchard and I had discussed on several occasions, we find that just these short bursts of self-care can help to manage and mitigate all these potentially damaging effects or deleterious, maybe we'll say deleterious is a better word, effects of being a caregiver. And that's an incredibly powerful message, because I think that even myself at times, I struggle to accept that it takes just a little bit of time to help to mitigate some of these effects, these hourly and daily, weekly, monthly, yearly effects, by just carving out a few minutes of your day to care for yourself. And I think that this really is at the heart of our Indigenous lifeways, is seeking out social support and staying connected. Without that connection, all people, not just folks of Indigenous descent or background, everybody, we begin to experience the ill effects of not being able to talk, to see, to communicate with one another. And I think a lot of us on this call probably have experienced that at some point during the COVID-19 pandemic. We feel like we're going stir crazy. We can't wait to see our loved ones again. We want to be able to socialize. It's inherently part of everything that we are as human beings. In some of the very practical steps that you can take, or to make a point to call a friend as often as possible. Ask your tribal health clinic or comprehensive center if they offer caregiver support groups or trainings. Seek out support groups on social media such as Facebook. And I know that a lot of people have been greatly helped by seeking out Facebook support groups to sort of manage a challenging time by talking to people who are like-minded and going through like experiences. And for most people, not all, but for people with internet access or access to Facebook, it's readily available. It's there whenever you need it. And for a lot of people, that's the most convenient, the most practical in terms of staying connected with people. Continue to maintain attendance at ceremony and other faith-based practices. and ask a friend or family member to go for a walk or help maintain the garden. Like I said, whatever you find of value. There's really no restriction. There's no formula to say that, well, you need to do A, B, C, and D if you're going to have any benefit, or you're going to avoid caregiver stress and fatigue by doing this, this, and this. We don't really know. We have some ideas. What I believe it is doing something that you really enjoy. If it's something that you enjoy, focus on that. Don't force yourself to do something that you may not find enjoyment. It just adds more distress to an already distressed state. And in terms of looking for bigger picture support, support that goes beyond just convenient support groups in your home. If you're really saying, you know, I'm really struggling and I need more than what is being offered right now. Oftentimes the Comprehensive Cancer Center survivorship clinics have caregiver support. Online support groups can be equally available. Tribal and local community services focusing on caregiver support. And if you do a quick Google search in your area, you may find a sort of a comprehensive caregiver support program that can offer assistance financially. They can offer counseling services. They can offer respite care, or which essentially just means they have an individual come into your home and care for your loved one while you're able to go out and run errands or, you know, self-care. And like I said, checking local resources for respite care is really, really critical as well. And that was a very poignant discussion I had in my interviews with people who say, I just wish there was somebody that could come to my house and help me just a few hours a week while I went out and did my grocery shopping. And here's a list of some caregiver resources and links. And if anybody's interested, I can send you this PowerPoint, which has all these links here. But these are pretty robust resources for cancer caregivers specifically. Some of them are actually surveys where you can participate in anonymous surveys that, you know, sort of ask questions about your caregiving journey. And I thought that when I did the interviews, people were very grateful that they were being asked about their journey. They're very candid about their experiences. And the Cancer Experience Registry and the Native American Cancer Research Organization, they offer these type of programs for caregivers if they want to, you know, the caregiver wants to give their experience. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Bouchard right now to briefly discuss some of the programs and research, as well as our survivorship clinic at Roswell Park, and how we are being proactive about caring for the caregiver.
Sure, thanks, Will. You know, one of the things that I think people, it's not always top of mind for people, but many of the programs and the supportive care programs that are available for patients, caregivers are often welcome to participate in them, even if it's not explicitly advertised that way. So for example, at Roswell Park, we offer yoga classes, meditation classes, some kind of fun activities, not really related to cancer, but just designed to help people have an enjoyable experience to help get their mind off of it. So for example, we have paint nights where people can come and engage in art as a way of helping to cope. And all of those kinds of programs are available to patients, survivors, and their loved ones and caregivers. And so no matter where people are geographically, I would encourage caregivers to think about those kinds of opportunities, and if there's something that might appeal to them and work with their context and their schedules. Many of those are available both in person, but there's also online and virtual opportunities to get engaged with that. Another really important thing to keep in mind is that the cancer care team is also there and can be an enormous support for the caregivers. So it's really important as caregivers have questions, or there might be aspects supporting the cancer patient that the caregiver just isn't able to do. For example, maybe providing transportation or company and companionship for the cancer patient while they're receiving certain treatment that's on site in a clinical context. Maybe the caregiver just can't do that. And it's really important to let the care team know that so that they can integrate that information as they're developing the care plan for the patient. But also the care team can help navigate the caregiver to these these additional kinds of resources. So they can help connect and make referrals if the caregiver thinks that some kind of therapy or mental health treatment might be helpful to them, but also different kinds of resources. There's many programs at Roswell Park, for example. We're developing a peer-to-peer caregiver support program, much like many peer-to-peer patient support programs, but explicitly focused on providing support for the caregiver. And American Cancer Society has programs like that. So there may be resources like that that caregivers are able to connect with to help find that kind of support.
Thank you. And also, the American Indian Cancer Foundation is a wonderful, wonderful resource for our Indigenous community as it relates to survivorship and caregiver. I believe this is the ACAF's first caregiver webinar, but go to the website. There are a lot of resources, infographics, links to resources that are incredibly valuable, even when I'm doing my own projects or navigating people to care or resources in my community. ACAF is the first place I recommend people go to. They've been incredibly supportive of our work and vice versa, but I think they're top notch in terms of being able to disseminate these ideas out to the community in a way that's palatable, it's culturally tailored, and is very poignant. So we don't want to forget ACAF and his caregiver. And so I like to leave a lot of my discussions with some practical information. It's nice to hear the information. Awareness is obviously one of the first steps in bringing about change. But from experience, caring for amongst others, I find that some of the things we can do briefly that have a tremendous effect is simply just breathing. And it sounds maybe it sounds too good to be true, that just by breathing, it can improve your quality of life or improve how you get through the day. But literally just 5, 10, 15 minutes a day of mindfulness activity, whether it's simply breathing, being mindful, belly breathing, gardening, tackling some artwork, it can be, or prayer, it can be incredibly powerful, especially during those very, very high stress times. I recommend a 4-7-8 breathing or box breathing, which is breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds. So you can picture a box of 4 seconds each. Or the 4-7-8 breathing, which is breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 7, breathe out through your mouth by pursing your lips for 8 seconds and repeat 3 or 4 cycles. By reestablishing that normal breathing cycle, it helps to balance and center you when you are feeling like your mind is kind of getting away from your body and you're in a high stress state. And there's certainly a lot of research to support that breathing is incredibly powerful for people under high levels of stress. Practicing daily gratitude and acceptance, which is something that I do every single day at night before I go to bed. Even on really crummy days when I don't feel the best, I try to recognize some of the things I'm most grateful for, and acceptance about the things I cannot control. And I think as a caregiver, these are I shouldn't say they're simple, they're not simple, but they are practical. And it's a way, if you recite it enough, you will start to believe it. You will start to believe that you are grateful for these circumstances happening in your life and how you found meaning in it. So don't overlook the value of just expressing daily gratitude, even when it's difficult. And I'm prioritizing daily health choices. So maybe just one healthy behavior a day, whether it's preparing a nutritious meal, just drinking clean water, which is very hard to do these days, actually, getting to bed early or just trying to get better sleep. And there are resources for that as well. Or just some light physical activity. Those things plugging throughout your day can help mitigate some of the caregiver stressors. And in terms of how we can support Indigenous caregivers or caregivers in general, and I call this a peacemaker principle, which is be present and mindful in their time of need. If you could take anything away from this discussion, it's be present and be mindful. Sometimes that's all you need. I often get too much clutter in my mind. I want to help other people, and I start thinking of programs and protocols and realizing, that's very daunting, but what can I do right now to help somebody in need? Be present, be available. And I think that's oftentimes enough for somebody who's going through a hard time. Not to say that's the only thing you can do, but if at the very least, let that be your focus. When somebody calls, you answer. When somebody asks need, you help them. And offer only what you can follow through with. Respect cultural principles, which we sort of mentioned earlier in the presentation, and increase your awareness of the challenges. And this is one way we can do this by, hosting a free webinar to the community. Watch YouTube videos, read internet articles. There are a lot of resources out there. Just become more familiar. I had no idea what my mother was going through until years later when I started to look into the caregivers and what they might be going through. So, my mom was right next door, and I did not know that she was going through these type of challenges. So educate yourself. It's free, and it can really help you understand and also be more present and more active with the caregiver, both the caregiver and those experiencing cancer. So just to wrap this up, what we have is a center plan moving forward for survivorship and caregiving. We're looking into developing patient navigation programs to assist the caregiver and the cancer patient along that care continuum. So there's much less voids. And the continuity of care is one of the elements that I found during my interviews that was very apparent. People were dropped off at the cancer center and basically fending for themselves. So we're looking at ways to help the caregiver through that process so they have the resources available to them immediately. We're exploring grant opportunities to support caregiver interventions so we can figure out how exactly we can do a better job at caring for our caregivers. Outreach and engagement, free community webinars, social media, and links to local resources, Indigenous caregiver trainings, collaborating with the tribal newsletters and our communities across the world. Actually, we work with the tribal Indigenous communities all across the world, and sharing this information, being involved with their media outlets, so this information can be disseminated to a larger, the larger community. And interdepartmental collaboration with community outreach engagement, which is led by Dr. Bouchard. We continue to do internal collaborations all the time, and today is one of those examples. And here are some of the primary resources I use for some of the slides. And I'm actually on time, so I think we can turn it over to our hosts if they have any questions for myself or Dr. Bouchard.
Everyone, please feel free to send in your questions as they come using the chat feature. I think maybe one question for either of you. At this point in time when people are socially distancing, do you have any tips for caregiving at a distance? What does that look like? What are some activities that people can do?
Dr. Bouchard, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can jump in. One of the things that's been really interesting with social distancing is, both there's social distancing, and then there's also that caregivers in their own life context, right, are dealing with a lot of change and figuring out different ways to integrate multiple demands, including caregiving. One of the things that we know is just such a critical role that many caregivers are helping with for their loved one is just being a source of emotional support, checking in on the person. And so to know that it's okay to be doing that, whether it's through Zoom or through a telephone call, or even sending, an uplifting package in the mail. Under all circumstances, many times caregivers live far away from the cancer patient. So, we still consider family members who might not live in the same geographic area, but are helping to make decisions for the cancer patient, help sometimes take care of some of the financial aspects. Those are all really critical caregiving roles. So just finding ways to be flexible and to continue to check in, but also, it's so important to also remember it's okay to let ourselves off the hook a little bit in a lot of and then, enough needs to be, okay sometimes, and what the caregiver is able to do.
What I would add to that as well is if you're able to get outside, get outside. Nature is an ally. Nature nurtures all of us. And I think that is a pretty clear Indigenous principle. And during this time, I have found that there are activities that can be done that safely at a distance with loved ones, whether it's going for hikes or fishing or just a casual stroll down the road. I think there's some safe activities and nature, and I didn't mention this in this discussion, but being outside, fresh air, having all your senses stimulated can be incredibly powerful for mitigating some of the effects of isolation. And when you're outdoors, it typically doesn't feel like you're all alone, even if you are all alone. I think that nature, spiritually has these healing properties, and you can plug and play whatever your favorite thing to do is outside. But that would be my recommendation: is if you feel safe with family members, close family members living in your household, use that opportunity to get outside. I think that being inside constantly in these artificial walls provides a lot of problems that I think a lot of us have probably have experienced over this pandemic.
Then we have a question from Facebook. Are there any resources to highlight for caregivers who recently lost their loved ones to cancer?
Will, is it okay if I jump in with this?
Sure it is. Yep.
Yeah. So we know, coping with bereaved caregivers who have recently, or even not so recently, lost a loved one to cancer have, in some ways, different needs than caregivers who are coping with the kind of the active treatment phases. This is where, the American Indian Cancer Foundation may have some specific resources related to this. Again, I know American Cancer Society has some very helpful fact sheets that you can very easily find through a Google search, as well as the National Cancer Institute, as far as kind of helping the caregiver identify, specifically what kinds of resources they may be looking for, whether it be mental health type resources, or even things, information about helping manage the estate. One of the really interesting things about caregiving is it doesn't always end even after your loved one has passed away. There's often a lot of caregiving tasks that the caregivers are still helping to manage. So depending what kinds of support and information, those are some of the kind of easy, broad level resources I would point you to. And this is also when you can still reach out to the cancer care team for support, or even your own healthcare provider, your primary care provider can help navigate you to specific resources in your geographic area that may be helpful.
In terms of that immediate emotional support, don't ever overlook friends and family. Obviously they're typically with you through the entire journey, but don't overlook that either. As is, like Dr. Bouchard had said, the cancer journey continues after the loss of a loved one, and family and friends can provide emotional support that can't be replicated. Although I would counter that by saying that having a trusted health professional, a counselor of some kind, can be incredibly valuable through the entire journey, and can also be a direct sort of hub for resources, additional resources, social work as well. A lot of our tribal clinics have medical social workers and grief counseling there in the community itself. So the family, the tribal clinics are really great immediate resources to have in that bereavement process.
I think with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Bouchard and Mr. Maybe, for sharing your information, your experiences with Indigenous cancer survivors. It was very eye-opening. I think while I have everyone here, I just want to announce and share an opportunity to celebrate survivors that we have this coming Saturday. On Saturday, June 27th, there'll be a virtual event, our virtual celebration of Indigenous life event, which will allow us to share stories, smudge, and give thanks, hear an honor song, and celebrate the sacred Indigenous lives of our survivors. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. A survey will be sent out after the webinar, but please feel free to send your questions again through help@acaf.org. And with that, just thank you.
Thank you, everybody.